Well, hello everyone. My name is Mohammed, and I'm here today to go through custom recipes for non-CPG. A little bit of background about myself. I do some consulting for small businesses, some medium-sized businesses as well, mainly in the food manufacturing aspect, some retail businesses as well. I'm the co-founder of Zones on Organic, and I actually have been part of this program that's offered by Food Access, formerly CLA, in the pilot year, the first year, I think it was 2020. So today we'll be going over costing recipes for non-CPG, a little bit of an agenda of what we're going through. Uh, we're going to go over first the differentiation between CPG, which is consumer packaged goods, and non-CPG. And then later we're going to understand the different types of costs. We're going to go over two models for recipe costing, and then which would lead us to the pricing strategy. After that, we will go over contribution margin, understanding that, a little bit of an analysis, and how it's beneficial to us when determining the costing and the pricing for our product. The break-even analysis, which in my opinion is the most crucial part when it comes to numbers, determining your costing and whatnot. And then initially I was planning to have the Q&A session at the end, but since we're a small group, we can kind of have it as we go. After each session, I'll just ask you guys if you have any questions, and we can answer them as we go. Uh, the I tried to condense a lot of information in a small presentation. So there's going to be maybe like new terminologies, formulas and stuff, so we can go over them section by section. So to start, uh, the main differences, we're not going to go in detail between CPG and non-CPG businesses. The consumer packaged goods, the CPG businesses, they focus mainly on packaged goods with a longer shelf life. So it's basically made in batches. You have like a large batch of one product that you make. The recipe kind of becomes a formula. It's set every time you produce it. It has a longer shelf life, and then it's sold as we grow. The kind of like inconvenience or like the challenge with CPG businesses, it's that they face greater inventory challenges and calculations. You have different steps of inventory. You have your raw material inventory. When you don't produce the whole batch in one production shift, you have work in process inventory. So the goods, the products are not fully made, they're not finished products. You have to determine a calculation for that, the cost of that, of the products that are sitting in your inventory and are not done yet. So it's a little bit more challenging, it's a little bit more delicate for the CPG businesses. Today we're focusing mainly on non-CPG businesses where they deal with fresh and perishable ingredients, and they're produced for like prepared food items, like mainly like restaurants, catering business, uh, products that do not have a shelf, like a strong or long shelf life, and they're not produced in mass batches. So you produce them today, you use them today or the next day, most likely. These types of products, they face unique challenges in cost and recipes because the ingredients, there is a lot of variability. Like the cost of ingredients, they could fluctuate from one day to another. The shelf life is very short. There is also basically like you cannot easily calculate the accurate cost because of waste and shrinkage. So you can buy as much ingredients as you need for a full recipe. You calculate the cost for that recipe to be sold all. If you don't sell a portion of your product, they get included in your cost. However, the products are wasted. So we're going to go over that a little bit more. This is just like an overview of that. So it is very important to accurately cost your recipes. This enables you to set the appropriate prices. Once you have a good idea about your costing, which would be in one of the models that we're going to introduce later on, you would know where you stand in terms of costing. You would know how much margin you need to cover the rest of your expenses, and you would know what prices are comfortable for you to be able to cover all of that and end up with a nice, healthy profit margin. It would allow you to optimize your resources. In a sense, when you know the true costing or like an approximate costing of your products or your recipes, you would be able to make a decision about whether to introduce machinery to your production line or like to your kitchen, like just to put it blankly. Scheduling becomes, you can make it more efficient to optimize your recipe making. You would know if you need to cut labor or add more, or how much to produce for each batch to be able to make your recipe more efficient. And it would allow you also to make informed decisions about your menu, your ingredients. If you see that one of the items is costing a lot and is not bringing in a lot of money, so like the contribution margin, which we will go over in a little bit, is not enough to cover the rest of the costs, you can make the decision whether to raise prices or just cut the item or like switch it. And finally, it helps ensure profitability and financial stability. If you know your costs, you would be able to make better decisions about your prices, which would allow for a nice profit margin, which would sustain your business for the long term. So this might be some basic information for some of you guys. We divide the costs into like three main sections. The part in red, the overhead, it's very debatable. It differentiates from a business to business, but we start with the fixed costs. These costs, they do not change no matter how much you produce. They're always fixed. These are your rent, it doesn't change. Your salaries, mainly for administrative jobs and like management jobs. So like if you pay somebody like who's a general manager, your marketing, your administrator, like you have a bookkeeper or an accountant, salaries that do not get directly affected by the number of units produced or by like how much of a recipe like you're developing, producing, how much you're selling, they're always fixed. They stay within the left side, which is the fixed cost side. Your insurance, your permits and licenses. So in general, the fixed costs do not get affected by whether or not you produce or how much you produce within a certain recipe. So contrarily, the variable costs, these fluctuate based on how much or whether or not you produce a recipe or a specific product. So ingredients, these are going to fluctuate based on how much you produce of a recipe. Your labor, this is just the direct labor that goes into producing the recipe. So your kitchen staff, mainly, if you have a direct supervisor that's specifically for the kitchen. Mainly, if you have somebody taking care of packaging, if you have somebody doing deliveries, for example, because if there is no recipes to be made, there is no deliveries, so that cost is gone out of the window. So it's variable. It varies based on how much you produce. Your packaging costs as well. This is variable. You just incur that cost if you are producing, if you're making the recipe. And then the overhead, which is sometimes referred to as mixed costs, like it takes some of the fixed, some of the variable, and it depends on your operation, like how you run your business. Some costs would be under the variable section, some costs would be considered overhead. So this is your utilities, transportation, like for the fuel, if you're renting something like to go to and from like a catering job, for example, disposables. This is like your gloves, if you use, for example, deli cups, tasting spoons, and event-specific rentals. How I like to define it, the overhead, it's costs that are difficult to measure per unit. So the ingredients, for example, you can measure them per unit produced. However, if you use napkins, for example, that you serve with like a plate, it's hard to count how many napkins that you're going to use and translate that into a cost. If you buy a box of napkins for $5, let's say it has 750 units, it costs us like maybe 1 cent per unit or something like that. Sometimes you grab a couple, three, unless like they're like a different quality of napkins, like if you can measure them. But the overhead is like hard to measure. Like utilities, you can't measure how much electricity you use per batch or like per unit produced. So I want to take a break here before we go into the first costing model and see if there's any questions, if the pace I'm going at is like fast or if it's reasonable or if we can keep moving forward. And I see we have more people here, so that's good. Okay. So, two costing models. The first one is more of a general model where we take all of the costs incurred into producing the recipe and calculate it in relation to the total sales. So this model, in a sense, helps understand the portion of cost of goods in relation to sales, and it's expressed as a percentage. What that means is that it includes all the costs, like everything that we bought in terms of ingredients, all the labor that we paid for, all the overhead, the utilities, everything that went into the production, like everything that we incurred, and in relation to the sales, and that gives us a percentage. And we derive it from this formula here. And then I take this down. Okay. So total cost of goods sold divided by sales, and then we include the inventory here. We have our beginning inventory, what we started with from the previous period, like what was left over. We add the purchases to it, whatever we bought during this period in terms of like ingredients, packaging, all the costs that go into producing the recipe, and we subtract the ending inventory, whatever is left over from this period. And then we add other costs to this and divide it by sales. What I mean by other costs is the costs that directly affect the production of the recipe. So I want to go over like a little example just to make it a little bit clearer here. We assume that we have inventory that's left over from the previous period. Let's say last month, it's worth $1,500. This is like your ingredients, your packaging, and whatever we purchased for the current period, all the inventory is equal to $10,000. Out of that, we are left with $1,000 worth of inventory, and then the other costs, which like include labor and everything that affected our production, is $4,500. The total sales from this period is $30,000. So our formula would go as follows. Leftover inventory is $1,500. We added to it, we purchased $10,000 worth of inventory, and then we take off whatever is left from this period, which is $1,000. To all of that, we add all other costs incurred in this period, which we said is equal to 4,500. That number would be equal to 15,000 divided by 30,000 equals 50%. So our cost of goods sold are expressed as a percentage, which is 50% of all of our sales. The leftover from that is our gross profit margin. From that, we're going to take off the fixed cost. Once we take off the fixed cost, we're left with our net profit margin. That's our profit. That's what we made at the end of the day. That's what's referred to as the bottom line. So again, just to summarize, including the inventory in this section, we take all of the costs incurred in this period and then divided by all the sales made in this period. It gives us the costing of a recipe in terms of a percentage of the total sales. And then whatever is left over is our gross profit margin. So this is more of like a generalized approach. It takes into account like all your waste, your shrinkage, your basically all the money that you have spent during the period and all the money that you have brought in. It's not like an actual accurate cost per item or per dish or per recipe. It's more generalized. The following model, this one is a little bit more intricate. Like it would give us the costing for the recipe and then goes into the unit costing. And this definitely helps us into pricing our product. Once we know how much the unit costs, and which would be theoretical because it's not always accurate. There's going to be fluctuations in pricing, in delivery fees, like the costs, they fluctuate. The recipe yield, sometimes like you have a recipe that you scale up that's supposed to be producing 200 units, and sometimes it produces 198, sometimes 204, like it fluctuates. So this model provides us the cost per unit produced. It aids in pricing decisions and resource allocation. This model also rarely provides the actual cost because the operation needs high levels of accuracy, efficiency, and predictability. What is meant by this is that if you have preset and predetermined pricing for your raw materials, your inputs, so like if you have contracts with your suppliers where you say, hey, for the next 6 months, I'm going to buy potatoes from you for, hypothetically, $10 a bag. No matter how much it changes, the price shouldn't change for me. The delivery fees, this is what they're going to be. My staff, I know they're going to be present. This is how much I'm going to pay them. My packaging, this is how much it would cost me. My utilities, all of that, I know ahead of time. I can predict it. I have an efficient operation where I don't have any waste, or I can manage the waste. Like I know what percentage it would be from all the costs, and I know accurately how much I can get from each recipe. So once we go over this model, I highly encourage you to use both models to have as much information as possible about your costing. The first one, when it takes all the costs incurred, you divide them by sales, so you know how much you made or how much the recipe cost you in relation to your sales. And then this model, you would go more in details. You would know the smallest of smallest costs within your recipe once you know your recipe, and it would provide you with a unit cost that would allow you later on to make pricing decision, sourcing decision, and like operation setup decisions as well. So the steps into going through this model. First, we're going to identify the variable cost. We're gonna make from our recipe. We have a recipe on a piece of paper. We say like we need, if we're making, I don't know, cookies, we need X amount of flours. We need chocolate chips. If it's a chocolate chip cookie, we need eggs. We need butter. We need all of these ingredients, everything like in one unified unit. Like if you're using grams, pounds, ounces, like have them all in the same. And you lay them out. You have all of your ingredients. You have your labor. How much does it take to produce one recipe? And the packaging that's used. If you're using plastic bags, if you're using like the small pouch bags or boxes, whatever it is. Then you will determine the quantity, specify the precise quantity of each component required for the recipe. Flour, we need 4 pounds of flour. Butter, 2 sticks of butter. Each stick is 8 ounces, so we need 16 ounces of butter. The chocolate chips, we need 2 cups. 1 cup equals, let's say, 4 ounces. So 2 cups is 8 ounces, so on and so forth. And then you start deriving your cost from there. You calculate your cost. So, for example, you have the flour. We said 4 pounds. You buy the flour at $3 a pound. 3 times 4, that's $12 just for the flour for this specific recipe. Butter, the stick is $2 per stick. We have 2 sticks, so $4 for the butter, so on and so forth. So once we have all the costs of all the ingredients, we add everything up and we see how much the recipe yields to us. So for all of those ingredients, for that labor, we produce 75 cookies. So we end up dividing all the cost of our ingredients by 75, which would give us the cost per unit, the cost per cookie. This is the formula when determining the cost per unit. So the total variable cost, like we said, the ingredients, the labor, the packaging, and some of the overhead, we divide it all by the total units produced. For the case of the cookies, we have the flour, the butter, the chocolate chips, the eggs. We add the labor. It takes us an hour and a half, for example, to produce this recipe. The packaging, how much packaging do we need for all the units produced, if we use any packaging, and the overhead, like if, let's say, like we use some gloves in it, we use some like foil tins that are not reusable, anything that's not necessarily measurable, we add it to it. And so these need to be the dollar amount. So the ingredients, like we said in the previous slide, right here, number 3, I'm sorry, when you calculate the cost. So when you multiply the quantity of each component by its respective unit cost. So we want the cost here, the cost of the ingredients, the cost of the labor, cost of the packaging and the overhead, divided all by the yield per recipe. And that would give us the cost per unit. And we're going to do an example right here. So we work at a restaurant. We make every day, we make the soup of the day. We know that a large pot of soup, let's say like it holds 8 gallons, it gives us 50 16-ounce bowls. So we cook, we have our recipe, we nailed it down, we know what ingredients we need, we know how much labor goes into that, we know all the necessary like materials and equipment that go into it, we know how much it gives us in terms of output. So now we're going to calculate how much each bowl of soup costs us, So we know how to price it at, how much to price it at. So the recipe yields 50 bowls. Each bowl is 16 ounces. The ingredients that go into the soup, $30. Between like, I don't know, tomato soup, like your onions, tomatoes, olive oil, so on and so forth. Labor, $40. And the labor, it's basically one person doing the soup, working 2 hours at $20 an hour. That gives us $40. Packaging, $7.50 if we're doing it like in containers that are meant to be to go, for example. And the overhead is approximately at $2 per recipe. So that's the trick about overhead, is that you need to determine a number that you allocate to each product in each batch. So the recipe cost per unit, all the variable costs, which is the ingredients, the labor, the packaging, and the overhead, and divided by how much does the recipe yield. The total is $79.50. They yield us 50 soups, 50 bowls of soup, which would equal to $1.59 per unit, per soup, per bowl. So based on this model, the second model, we can go and determine our pricing. But before we get into an actual number of like the price, we need to determine our goals, like our objectives for the pricing. Do we want to maximize profit? Do we want to penetrate the market, like having a low price? There is a lot of competition and we come through with like undercutting a lot of people. Where do we want to be within what's our objective? What's our goal with the market? So we need to also consider the demand, our competition, and perceived value in our product, into what we add, our position in the market. And just a note on this, for these types of businesses, for where we're at with like our position in the market and what we do, and I've taken a look at your guys' businesses, the products that you offer, they're great. I believe that the better strategy, the better approach into pricing your product would be to price it at a premium based on the value that you add, based on the differentiation that you have. So I don't believe that have pricing your product lower than competition, or like going over like shrinking your cost to have like a lower price, would be a strategically better move, because what sets you apart is your differentiating factor. People would buy because of you, because of your brand, because of what you do, not because of the cheap prices that you have. So I wouldn't focus too much on having like undercutting competition, or having like the cheapest quote unquote price in the market, because your customers would not tend to be very price elastic. So which means that you charge them a premium, they're happy to pay for it because they like you, they like your product, they like your story and what you're about, rather than the convenience factor of like you're cheaper than a bigger brand. Because if you start doing that, you're going to go into a price war that's difficult to manage, because we don't have quite the resources to fight bigger companies that could keep undercutting price and like run you out of business. So don't focus too much on like the price, the low price that you offer. Rather focus on having a comfortable profit margin that would satisfy your fixed costs and leave you like a nice healthy profit for yourself. And then we would want to implement dynamic pricing strategies to adapt to changing market conditions. So like when, for example, COVID happened, there was a shortage in a lot of materials, like in a lot of ingredients. So the price went up. You wouldn't want to keep charging the same price if your costs are increasing, like you're not going to make any money. So you need to be revising your costs, like keeping track of them all the time. Whenever you need to revise your price, you do so. So there are two very important terms and formulas. One is the contribution margin and one is the break-even analysis. So the contribution margin is basically the proportion of each sales dollar that contributes to covering the fixed costs and generating profit. So going back to the soup example, for example, which I have right here, if we set the price at $7, our variable costs that we calculated earlier came up at $1.59. The contribution margin, what this product, that the one bowl of soup contributes to covering our fixed costs and leaving us with a profit, is the sale price, which is $7, take off the variable cost, and it leaves us with $5.41. This is very important because it would help us determine at which price or at which amount of sales and which units sold we would break even. We wouldn't make or lose any money. When we would target that number initially and move forward above that to make more money. So a continuation of the contribution margin, we want to get the ratio. So the percentage, the contribution margin expressed as a percentage. So it's the proportion of each sales dollar that contributes to covering fixed costs and generating profits, expressed as a percentage. It would be the selling price for the soup, for example, it's the $7. We take off the variable cost per unit, which is the $1.59, and divide all that by the selling price again, the $7 one more time. So the contribution margin ratio would equal to $5.41. That's our price minus the variable cost, divided by $7. That's our selling price. And the soup contributes 77.3% of the price of the bowl of soup would be contributed to covering fixed costs and profit margin. So now that it's in sequence, we determined our variable cost, we have our price, we know our contribution margin, how much the product contributes to covering the rest of the cost. Now we want to know the break-even. At which amount, in terms of units or dollars, we break even. Our business does not make any money and does not suffer any losses. So two types of break-even, but we need to determine it in units, how many units we need to sell to break even. And it's expressed as follows. So it's the fixed cost. In our second or third slide, it was the part to the left where it was like our rent, our admin costs, the salaries, the insurance, the permits, all of that stuff, the costs that do not change, the fixed costs. We divided by the selling price per unit minus the variable cost per unit. In other words, it could be expressed as the fixed cost divided by the contribution margin. So theoretically, like each business, like if you're in a restaurant, catering, your non-CPG business, you're going to have several products. It's not like this is theoretical, like just one product. If you have more than one product, you have multiple products, you're going to divide your fixed cost by each one of those products, your selling price per unit for each product, and you take off the variable cost per product. So in other words, it would be the fixed cost for the whole business divided by the contribution margin of each product. And that would give you the most accurate break-even point in terms of units of how much you need to sell for you to break even. Now, the break-even in dollar amounts, it's the same principle, but it's just how much money we need to bring in to break even. The break-even in sales is in the previous slide, the break even in units, how many units we have in order, like we have to sell in order to break even times the price per unit. So the soup, for example, we have, let's say, three soups that we're selling. One is $7, one is the premium for $9, and one is like more traditional for $5. Each one contributes a specific amount. We found out that we need to sell 100 of the premium soup. The $7 one that we said we need to sell 170, and the traditional one we need to sell 250 of it. So we take each one of those numbers, multiply it by the selling price of each one of them, and that will give us how much sales we need to make in order to break even. So this could also be expressed as all the fixed costs divided by the contribution margin ratio, which we found back here, the 77.3%. So this is a lot of information that's packed and condensed in a somewhat short presentation. I want to get like a lot of your questions to know like where to elaborate a little more. But before that, I want to have kind of like a summary of the important concepts to keep in mind and some suggestions moving forward, like in the future. So fixed costs, we need to know that those are the costs that are fixed, that do not vary no matter how much we produce or whether we produce or not. Your rent, you're going to pay it whether you produce or you don't produce. Your insurance, you're going to have to pay it whether you produce or not, so on and so forth. Variable costs, it's the complete opposite of that. These costs fluctuate based on whether or not you produce your recipe, how much of your recipe you produce. These are costs that directly affect your production. Overhead, also known as mixed costs, it could be some variable and some fixed costs. What I like to express it as, it is the costs that are hard to measure per unit produced, or per recipe produced, or per batch produced. Contribution margin, this is the amount of dollar amount, like the amount of sales that is left over from each product after satisfying the variable cost. After we pay for the variable cost for that product, what is left to us to cover the rest of the cost, the fixed costs, and to leave some money for us for the profit. And then the break-even point, which is, I think, in my opinion, the most important concept in all of these, where it allows us to know how many units we need to sell in order for us to break even, and how much money we need to bring in order for us to break even. It is highly encouraged to use both costing models for better accuracy. The first model, where it takes all the costs, we divide them by the sales, which gives us a percentage, and that percentage tells us how much money we spent and to bring in that money. The money that's left over, the percentage that's left over, also that's our gross profit margin. And then efficient operation helps in controlling costs and profit margin. So if you have a consistent operation, if you know what you're doing every time you're in production or you go into the kitchen, and it's systematic, it's scheduled, you don't go with the flow like each day, it would help you control your costs, it would help you plan ahead, and it would help you measure your profit margins. And the most important practice in all of this is record keeping. It's key to being aware of your business's financial health. If you keep track of every single thing that happens within your business, your purchases, your production schedule, you log your production, your yields, your variances, all of that, it would definitely put you at an advantage to your competition to make better decisions about your costing, your pricing, and it would put you in a better situation, basically, so you can like predict the future, you can forecast better, and you can make decisions to fix what needs to be fixed as soon as it happens or even before it happens. So this wraps the conclusion for the presentation for today, and that's our conclusion. I want to thank you guys for your attention and open the floor for questions and discussions, and we can elaborate on any section of the presentation. Just tell me the slide number and we can go to it.
Thank you so much. This was great. I love how detailed it was. Guys, any questions?
I
I
have
have
a
a
question.
question.
Oh, go ahead.
This is Mercedes. Okay, so it sounds like calculus to me, if I'm being quite honest. It is so hard, even with seeing it on paper and to see that you need to sort of divide the cost. My husband has created seasonings and sauces that we use as our signature items here in the restaurant. And we are in the process of, we've already done the ingredients list, but now we want to get them to online retail and to be able to sell them here in the restaurant. And so to really come up with, you know, the ingredients and how to divide them to really say what we should be charging for the seasoning or the sauce has been like, I mean, I just don't want to do it. You know, so I know this class is great for me, but what are some things along with what you shared today of how we can actually sort of put it together kindergarten style? Because it just feels like this is college material and I'm just out of it.
So that is great for the sauces and the spices. I think that's a good idea to have in addition to the restaurant. It would be like a different channel of sales. That would fall under the CPG category because you're gonna be packing these guys. They're gonna be on the shelf. They have a longer shelf life. However, we could use the second model, which is the little bit more complicated one, like you were saying, the little bit more elaborate one. I want to go the steps. Where are the steps? These ones. So you said you have the recipe.
Right.
No matter where you start, I think any recipe, no matter at which like fancy level of calculations or not, it starts with like a scratch piece of paper, like where you write down like, hey, you put this much of this spice, this much of this spice, you mix them up, and then we have this much of like the new products that we make. So
Okay.
first of all, you need to identify those specific ingredients that go in. However you're doing it right now, like you don't need to scale it up or down or anything. The way you're doing it just right now, what goes into it? Once you know those ingredients, go back to your receipts and find out how much it costs you to buy those ingredients.
Okay.
You tally them like on a piece of paper. You say like, okay, theoretically, salt, it cost me $5. Black pepper cost me $2. Coriander cost me $6. Tally that all of those up. Once you have the total and you have the ingredients that go into like making that, then once you make it, find out how many portions you have, how many jars. If it's like a 2-ounce jar and you mix the spices, they come up to like 20 ounces, for example, with your like scratch piece of paper recipe. 20 ounces, each portion gives you 2 ounces. That will give you 10 portions, so 10 jars. So now that same concept, you go back to the receipts that $5 for the salt, $3 for the black pepper, $6 for the coriander. Total them up and divide them by the 10 portions that we got. Like
Okay,
that,
got it.
it gives you the ingredient cost per portion. So we took care of the ingredients. Now the labor, your time, because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of food business owners, especially, they're owner and operator. Like you would be in the kitchen cooking as well or making like
Yeah.
whatever you do. You need to count yourself as an employee. You need to account for your time separate from being an owner. So when you go into
Mm-hmm.
the kitchen to produce, imagine that you hired somebody to produce for you. So their time is going to go into your recipe.
Right.
So to make those spices, it took you 1 hour between like mixing, portioning, packaging, labeling, all of that. They're done 1 hour. 1 hour, you're one person, you pay yourself $20 an hour, then it costs $20 to make that batch of 10 portions.
Mm-hmm.
So the same concept as calculating the ingredients, you take that $20, which is your labor cost, divided by 10. 10 portions of a month.
$2.
Exactly. So $2.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have $2 of labor. We have, I think, like $1 for the ingredients.
Yeah.
Packaging 15 cents, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Then the cost is $3.15. Now we went from like just a scratch piece of paper recipe,
Yeah.
like writing, to translating into numbers, to knowing how much the cost is. That $3.15, we need to plug it into a couple of formulas to know what is a healthy margin for us to like cover all the other costs. For that, we need to know how much we can sell. You said like you're gonna put it online and at the restaurant. Since you're already operational, you know your demand, like roughly how many people would want to buy those sauces or those spices.
Mm-hmm.
You do some forecasting. You say like, okay, if theoretically I sell 1,000 of these a month, I put it at $8. That's gonna make me $8,000. My cost is $3.15 per
Wow.
unit.
Mm-hmm.
So 3,150 cents. What is left, the contribution margin, what we were saying, it's 4,000 plus, almost $5,000. That's going to help me cover all the other costs, like the fixed costs, like my rent, advertising, the online, like the website fees, the marketing, all of that stuff. And I want to make sure it would leave me some percentage at the end.
I get it. And that makes a lot of sense. So now I'm thinking, because we had been selling a 5-ounce jar for $5. So if I'm using the math that you just gave me, theoretically, I'm coming up short. So
Yeah.
we're gonna
And
have to look at how we're pricing it based on the person that we're using to actually the time it takes, the cost
Exactly.
factors. Okay, I
Exactly.
got it.
And
Thank
also
you.
remember, you don't want to play on like having the cheap prices. If it's something
Right.
specialty, if it's like a specialty product,
Yes.
you sell it at a
Yes.
premium. People are gonna buy it because it's good. They like you. They like the brand. They like
Mm-hmm.
the company. Rather than it's like cheap. They can just go buy Kroger or like whatever. Go to Costco, load up on whatever it is, and like they're done. We're not targeting those customers. We're targeting the people who are our fans. Like they're obsessed with us. They like what we're doing. So they're going to help support us. If we charge them $10 for that jar, they're gonna pay for it. If 10% of the people don't pay for it, that's fine. Like you're left with
Right.
90% of people, but you're making way more money.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Francoise, you had a question.
Yes. So my question was about the first costing model.
Yeah.
Can you explain again or repeat what are the other costs?
So in short,
Are
it would be the costs that directly affect the production of the recipe. I'm gonna go back a couple slides before, right here. You take all of your variable costs, everything that goes into producing the recipe, your ingredients, labor, packaging, all the overhead, everything that you have spent during that month to make your recipe, not including the
okay.
fixed costs.
Okay,
So I
understood.
know, for example, like for the kitchen, that's it's a little bit tricky because it could be fixed and it could be variable. If you increase the
Right.
recipe, you would increase your hours, and then it would become almost like a variable cost. However, you want to treat that as like your capacity. Like for example, like the 40-hour plan, you can produce 4,000 units in a month. So you treat it as a fixed cost up until 4,000 units.
Mm. Okay.
And then because that's it's very tricky just for this specific case, like for the kitchen, because I've dealt with
Yes,
that a
yes.
lot. So you need to go with brackets, like it's fixed up until a capacity. Once you move up, it's gonna go up with you too. But it stays as a fixed cost. So to answer your question, the other cost, everything that directly affects the production of the recipe. Include your overhead, like all your gloves, include like
Okay.
even like if you have a catering job, all the costs that you incurred specifically for that catering job gets involved too. So in other words, the cost of sales, what did it cost you to make those sales?
Okay.
A catering job is bringing you $3,000. You spent altogether $1,000 between your labor, your ingredients, your like a little bit of overhead, your disposables, all of that stuff. You rented a truck to like transport your
Mhm.
equipment and everything for that specific job. That cost you $500. You hired a couple extra help people on site to help you sell or promote or whatever for an extra $500. So all of those costs come up to $2,000. The sales you made 3,000. So you divide 2,000 by 3,000. That would be roughly 67%. So that job, it costs you 67% of your total sales. So cost of goods sold, in other words, it would be how much did it cost you to bring in those sales? Did I answer you or no?
Okay. Understood.
I think
Thank
you
you.
did.
Yes,
Of course.
did. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying all good. Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions? I think we're clear then.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
I was expecting a lot more questions. This makes me happy.
Maybe they just need a little bit more time to process it, but
Yeah, I mean, so if I put my email here at the end, if anybody has questions or you want to develop a little bit more on like what we talked about, please just feel free to reach out. I'm trying, so I have like some worksheets that I have compiled for other clients before. I can maybe if there is some time, like put something together that summarizes this to do like some kind of like plug and play, like with your own recipe, and it would make it a lot easier to determine your cost. But that's depending on how much time there is. So if after today or like any other day after you have questions, like you look at the presentation, you go through it and you're like, hey, this doesn't make sense, or I thought I understood this, but I don't, just shoot me an email. Like I'll be happy to get in touch with you guys.
thank you so much. I'm gonna let you go then, and I'm just going to keep the guys for another minute,
Yeah,
and I'll reach out to you because I do have other questions, but I'll email you about it.
of course. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you
Well,
so
thank
much.
you so much. Thank you,
Have
everybody.
a good one.
Bye. You too.
Thank you.
Hold on, guys. Let me just stop recording.